Good evening, everybody. This is our first class session for Wesleyan History and Polity. I'm expecting 5 more students to join us, but you will learn that Mr. Wesley talked about Methodists doing everything on the hour at the time. And so it is 6 o'clock Central Time. I have started a recording because at least one student indicated there might be a conflict for her and she was interested in having a recording. So that will be just part of the deal for these first 2 class sessions. Let's open with a word of prayer. Almighty God, we're grateful for the opportunity of a new year with the challenges and the opportunities that it brings. We're grateful for the presence of your Holy Spirit in our lives and pray that as we go through this class, your Holy Spirit might open our eyes to see what you've been doing in the Methodist movement, that you would open our understanding so that we might go more deeply into what it means to be a Methodist Christian. All these things we ask in Jesus' name, and all God's people said, amen. Friends, I want to invite any questions about the syllabus and our organization. We did have the Zoom meeting back in December where I covered some of those questions, but I wanted to review that because not everybody was a part of that meeting and all that sort of thing. Chris asked me a question. He happened to be the first one on tonight about the reflection papers. You want to rephrase it, Chris, and let the whole group hear?
Yeah. I basically asked how much of the reflection paper should be summary and how much of the reflection paper should be addressing the main question. And then I also wanted to follow that question up with, do you want us to address all 3 readings together, or do you want us to break it up into 3 separate sections for each reading?
Well, there are actually 4 reading reflections. Each one should be 1,000 words. 2 of them, one of them should be a chapter in Heitzenrader, 2 of them chapters in Ritchie, and then one on the Book of Doctrines and Disciplines. So that there are 4, each one ought to stand alone. The basic thing is I want your paper to show that you actually did the reading. So obviously there ought to be some references to the reading, but not a summary. 1,000 words is not very long. And so you really ought to talk about what the reading was addressing and why it's important. Why is it a part of a class like this? What significance for the Methodist movement does it have? It's really just a way of helping you organize your thoughts prior to our in-person sessions on the 8th. Other questions about the syllabus or the flow? Chris made a comment right away that this was going to be a sprint of a class. I get it. I've never taught an intensive class like this before. And I'm not sure you all have taken it, but I'll be really interested in your feedback afterwards. But I said about a sprint, the good news is once you've run the 100 yards, it's over and you can go do something else. Now, for you all, the final exam on the 12th is going to bring the in-person part to a close. You then have a few weeks before the term paper is due. And then February 2nd, you're a free bird. So that's the way it's going to go. In a minute, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. I'm sort of waiting to see if some others join us here. We are going to be spending a good bit of time together on Zoom today and tomorrow, and then also in person next week for a long time each day. I don't know if any of you all are going to be brand new to the Waco campus. I will have an hour's lunch break each day, but I don't know how easy it is to find lunch in 1 hour. I've seen people lined up at a student cafeteria kind of place. The parking garage is very close to Truett, and so you can get to a fast food place, but you may also just want to bring your own food and eat lunch there at Truett. Any other logistical questions you all have? I have several email addresses. And so some of the email you got from me was from my Global Methodist account, sjones@globalmethodist.org. I have a Baylor account, Scott_J_Jones@Baylor.edu. I've got a few others as well, but those are my two primary ones, and you're welcome to communicate with me by either one. I've also given you my cell phone number. You're welcome to text me. So I'm trying to stay on top of all this communication with you all for the duration of this course. All right, well, let's begin by introducing ourselves to each other. And I'm interested in, where you are in your education, where you're from, what denomination you're a part of, anything else that you'd like to share with the group. Chris, why don't you start off? You're the upper left of my screen. I know everybody's screen is different in this Zoom world, but I'll just call on you all by name and start with you, Chris.
All right. I'm Chris. I am a second-year Truett student getting my MDiv. I currently go to Antioch Community Church, so kind of non-denominational, but we have Wesleyan roots. And then, was there anything else that I'm missing?
Where's your home originally?
Oh yeah, I'm from Houston originally, so I just got back from the holidays from there on Monday.
So you obviously live in Waco on campus. You have any advice for lunch for the ones who are commuting in?
I mean, the Grease Pit, which is just a bunch of fast food, is like right across the highway. It's just west of the highway, and then I don't know if the student union building will be open, but they have a Chick-fil-A, a Panda Express, and I think one or two healthy options.
You don't count Chick-fil-A as healthy? My daughter thinks it's the be all and end all of all kinds of food.
My soccer friend would disagree with your daughter, unfortunately.
Okay. So are you headed toward ordination?
I'm not sure yet. We'll see. I'm just
Okay.
asking the Lord right now.
All right. Everett.
My name is Everett. I currently live in the Woodlands, Texas, just north of Houston. I'm on staff at the Woodlands Methodist, which is associated with the Global Methodist Church denomination. I just finished my first semester of seminary this past fall, whatever just ended, fall. And so currently in pursuit of the MDiv and discernment on ordination as well.
And where are you from originally?
I originally grew up in the outer region of San Angelo, Texas.
Okay. Good. Sharon.
Hello, I'm Sharon Smith. I just finished up my first semester at Truett in the MDiv program. And I entered the program not quite sure what God was going to use it for. And right in the middle of midterm prep, he decided that my family was going to move from Temple to Grandview. I just started pastoring a new Global Methodist church here. So that's been a lot, a lot to adjust to. I'm looking forward to this class, as obviously it is pertinent and helpful with everything we're dealing with in that congregation. So I had the privilege of working with Clinton for the past 10 years in Temple. So it's good to see him in class. It'll be fun.
So did you just start your pastorate?
October 1st. Yes, I reached out with a question about a post, and 2 weeks later, they had offered it to me. I had thought I would start after Christmas, but then their interim left abruptly, and they asked October 1st. So that was something. But we made it, and we made it through Christmas. And I'm almost finished with all of your reading. Not yet.
Oh, very good.
I'm just being honest.
word. I mean, you're ahead of schedule, but maybe you have a sermon to prepare for Sunday, right? Well, good for you, Sharon. All right, Clinton.
My name's Clinton Sharp. I'm originally from Central Missouri, but moved to Texas to go to Truett. And so I got my Master's of Divinity at Truett in 2009. And right after that, started working in Temple, Texas at Foundation. At the time was United Methodist Church. And so I've been there now 14 years doing youth ministry and enjoying it, loving it. And but would like to seek ordination and appointment someday. And so once my church joined the Global Methodist Church and denomination, I'm seeking ordination. And so that's why I'm taking this class and a couple others, and excited to finally learn a lot of these Wesley things that I hear in the church often.
And which church and temple are you working at?
Foundation.
Okay. Good. All right. Justin, we're doing an introduction. What's on your, well, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. I'm Justin Harris. My wife, Valerie Harris, is with me. We both go to the Woodlands Methodist Church in the Woodlands. We live in the Woodlands, or actually our address is Conroe, but it's closer to the Woodlands. I'm originally from Marshall, Texas. I attended First United Methodist Church in Marshall for most of my life. That church, I think, is 200 years old, somewhere in there. It's a historical church. I have seen a lot of history there. I'm fourth semester at Baylor in the Wesley House program, and I'm on track to get ordained as a deacon this summer in the Global Methodist Church.
All right. Valerie, we can see you too. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So obviously I live in the same place as Justin, and I have one more class after this class, so I should be graduating in May. I am a ordained deacon in the Global Methodist Church and pursuing a ordination as an elder this summer. So I am currently working on those questions as well as this class at this time. I think that was all the questions.
Yeah.
Originally from, I'd say Houston. I grew up in Katy on the west side of Houston.
Okay. Are you all working in a church at the current time?
Not at the current time. We both have secular jobs and we're pursuing education at seminary at the same time. So you want to say what you do right now?
Yeah, I work in construction. I'm in a pre-construction at a general contractor. I do estimating and for our company. But actively working on trying to shift gears and go where God's calling me, and that's going into ministry.
And I'm an engineer, worked in oil and gas for over 20 years, and helping a startup company in renewable electric natural gas. And I actually last year did a residency in chaplaincy at Houston Methodist and really enjoyed it. So everyone at the hospital was like, "You did what for 20 years? What are you doing here?" And now everyone at the startup is like, "What? You did what at the hospital? And now you're doing this?" So just confused everyone.
Get it. I didn't ask any of the rest of you. Everett, you're working at the Woodlands Church, right?
Yes, sir. I'm on staff at the Woodlands Methodist Church under the Next Gen department.
Okay. And Chris, are you working anywhere?
I actually work for the seminary. I work with Melissa Lambeth in scholarships, and then I work at Antioch as well, doing administrative stuff for our tech team.
Okay. And Sharon, what about you? You're pastoring, of course.
I'm working
Duh.
at First Methodist Grandview.
Okay. And Clinton, you're doing youth ministry at Foundation, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Janisa, you're the last one on the screen that we haven't heard from, except me, and I'm going to go last. So you're up.
My name is Janisa Stegmoller. I live in Pretty, Texas, about 100 miles west of Waco. My husband and I have a construction company and a sheep farm and 2 teenagers. I'm active in our businesses as an administrator. And I also provide pulpit supply for about a dozen churches in my area, rural churches, that are affiliated with the Global Methodist Church. My home church is Goldthwaite, First Methodist Goldthwaite, and I'm about halfway through my MDiv at Truett. And I started as, leaning toward ordination in the Methodist Church and had no idea about the formation of the Global Methodist Church or the upcoming split. I knew there had been some controversial and tense general conventions, but the formation of the Global Methodist Church and the Wesley House of Studies at Truett was a great encouragement to me. The news came out the summer of 2020, the fall before I began my Truett journey. And it was just such a confirmation that I was in the right place at the right time.
So 100 miles, what does that take? An hour and a half for you to
Yes,
drive?
it takes about an hour and a half, but where I live, it's 40 miles to a good grocery store. So I make it work.
Yeah, I get it. All right. Well, very good. Well, there are 3 other names on my student list who are not here right now, but we'll see if the list is wrong or exactly how it's going to work. One of them said she might have a conflict, and so I am recording this class session. A little bit about me. I don't know where I'm from. Because I was born in Tennessee. I did grade school near Chicago, junior high in Indiana, high school in Denver. I went to the University of Kansas chasing a girl. That didn't work out. I stayed and met Mary Lou the next year. That did work out. She has deep roots in Kansas. Her father had 49 first cousins, all of whom stayed in Republic County. So up in north central Kansas, she knows lots of people and is well related. Justin, she's a highway contractor. My wife built bridges for many years, owned the company for 35 years, and the company has about 100 employees scattered from Nebraska to West Texas. So this contractor church thing has been my whole life. I was a stockholder in Reese Construction Company because I wanted to go to the stockholder meetings and find out what was going on. And now our daughter has bought the company from Mary Lou, and she's running the business. That's a 4th generation thing. I'm a 4th generation Methodist preacher. And I have some stories to tell about growing up in a family that did not know much about Wesley or Methodism. My father was president of the Iliff School of Theology for 13 years and then dean of Duke Divinity School at the time of his death. But I was not taught my Methodist heritage. And I probably will tell that story as we go through some things tonight. I live in Dallas, so for me, it's an hour and a half journey every time I come to Waco. I was a bishop. Well, first of all, I was a pastor for 11 years in 3 churches in the North Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church. Then I joined the faculty at Perkins. I had been teaching already for 13 years, adjunct at Perkins, and 7 years I worked full-time on the faculty teaching evangelism and Methodist studies classes, United Methodist Doctrine, History, Polity. Then in 2004, I was elected bishop of the United Methodist Church and sent to Mary Lou's home state. We had 12 years in Wichita. Then at the end of the 12 years, that was the maximum, and the church sent me to Houston, where for 6 years I was bishop of the Texas Annual Conference. Then last December, I retired from the United Methodist Church, and 9 days later was accepted as a bishop in the Global Methodist Church. So I live in Dallas, and I travel just a ton. I am bishop of 16 different annual conferences, stretching from the Philippines to Africa to West Texas. So part of the reason for this intensive course is that I still want to be able to teach at Truett, but I can't manage having to be home for a Monday morning class every week. So the school was willing to try this intensive model. I think it might be good for you guys, but your feedback will be really important as to both, is this a good way to structure an essential course? And is it, are there better ways that I can do it? There is an evaluation that's done each semester, and so I really want your feedback to tell me how it's working and all of that. So that's kind of an experiment and something that we're getting ready to try out. And at the moment, I'm planning to do another intensive course next August, so that each semester my contribution to the Wesley House will be that. On the other hand, I will be present for some Wesley House activities during the semester. But quite frankly, I'm traveling so much for my Global Methodist stuff. For 42 days in February and March, I'll be going around the world, literally. So it's just lots of stuff going on. But fortunately, Zoom has taught us how to do things from a distance, and email and other methods have helped with that as well. Any other logistical questions or things about the syllabus? Justin and Valerie, I've got you down on my list as Valerie Walker.
Which is also correct. I legally changed my name right after we got married just over a year ago. It's Valerie Walker Harris now, but I did not change it within the Baylor system because that can be, I'm so close to being done that would have been very confusing to everyone.
I get it. My wife kept her maiden name Reese because she was president of Reese.
Right.
Right. And then my daughter married a man who goes by Reese as his first name.
Oh, that's hilarious.
This name stuff is a huge controversy in our family. You know.
Well, I kept Walker, but I added on Harris. So my all worlds I can fit in.
Okay. Well, very good. Good enough. Well, please stay in touch with me, ask questions, send emails. I try to be responsive, not immediately, because I might be in a meeting with some other people, but I do try to pay attention to your communications as much as possible while we're doing this stuff. I want to say something about this book. Thank you to you all who called attention to the fact that a revised and updated version had been put there. That last chapter, about 2000 to 2022, is the new part, and it's been written primarily by Ashley Boggin, okay? I do not know her. I am acquainted with the other 3 authors, and I have very high respect for all 3 of them. However, Ashley Boggan's contribution has a number of factual errors in it. It also has some emotionally laden adjectives in it, like surprising and justifiable, and things that a more objective scholar would not have included. So, in the introduction to this edition, she calls attention to a website that the General Commission on Archives and History has put and I put it in the email to you all this afternoon, where if you will enroll in that website, you have access to some electronic versions of key documents. I am asking that you all read all of the documents from 2013 on, because that's an antidote to what I perceive to be a less than professional bias that she's brought to the writing of that chapter. And so the antidote to that is to pay attention to the primary sources and read them for yourself. So that's a sort of new addition to what's going on in the life of the course there. I've also added some other readings, sent them to you both by email, and I put them on Canvas that would be useful for you to look at while you're there. So this course is aimed at covering Wesleyan history. Interestingly enough, there used to be a course at Perkins that was a separate course on polity, the organization of the church. I find, having taught this once in a combined way, a year, I guess, last spring, that doing both together makes a lot of sense, because the polity of the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church is something that's grown up over time, and that we will be studying as it develops, in a sense. And yet the last part of Thursday's class next week will be devoted to really going over in some detail the polity of the Global Methodist Church. Now, as I heard you all's introductions, all of you except Chris are aiming at some sort of life in the Global Methodist Church. Chris, you're obviously part of Antioch, which has Wesleyan roots. I've just been learning a little about Antioch the last few months. But once again, I'm not competent to teach what that church is doing. But the kind of study we're doing of the GMC will be useful to you to sort of go deeper into that church and its network of relationships, and teach you how to ask the right sorts of questions. So that's what we have to say about that stuff. Any other questions about the logistics or the syllabus before I just start in on my lecture here?
We were in a mad dash to get home, so I need to take just 2 minutes. I'm gonna go grab some paper to write on real quick. I'll be right back.
I'll tell you all that I typically go for about an hour and a half at things, and then I need a break for biological reasons. And so that will be our pattern when we're together face to face, but also tonight and tomorrow night. So we'll take a little break somewhere at the halfway point and let people go. I also have no problem with drinks or food in the classroom. And so, especially since we're working from 9 to 5 each day, do what you need to do, and we'll figure out how to study this stuff together. Well, let me talk for a minute about the purpose of this class. And I am a historian and I love church history. I do it for a number of reasons. And really, I think it goes back to my first exposure to Wesley. I was a philosophy major at the University of Kansas, and working on an honors thesis. And my advisor, a man named Rex Martin, took me to lunch. As we were walking to the student union, he said, "You're a Methodist." And I said, "Yes." He said, "You must believe in the warmed heart." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "John Wesley and Aldersgate." I said, "I don't know anything about that." That was a sign that somehow, even though I had been raised lifelong in the Methodist Church and was working in a Methodist campus ministry at KU, I didn't know my own heritage and background. I get down to Perkins, and I'm supposed to take moral theology in my second semester, but I went to the first class session and thought I didn't like the professor, and so I dropped it and found that a man named Albert Outler was teaching Wesley and the Wesleyan tradition. So I signed up. That whole semester, Dr. Outler was lecturing, and it was like Roberta Flack. He was killing me softly with his songs, strumming my fate with his fingers, telling my life with his words, killing me softly. I sat in that class and I said, "That's me. I'm home." Billy Abraham was my good friend. He said, "Jones, you're a genetic Methodist." Well, that may be true, but what really happened was that nobody had taught me my own heritage, my own story, and Dr. Outler gave me words for that. My whole life since 1978 has been dedicated not only to serving God as a pastor and in other ways, but to helping people learn the Wesleyan movement. Sometimes there are people who are born and bred Wesleyans. Others are newcomers to the tradition who were looking for some answers, and they simply found them in Wesley and Methodism. Why do you study history at all? Well, there was a famous scholar when I was a PhD student named Heiko Obermann, who said that the study of history is like mining for diamonds. You move tons of earth to get one little stone. It only weighs a few grams, and then it's only useful if you polish it and deploy it somehow, maybe split it into smaller pieces. Well, one way to talk about this is that in studying history, you're looking for nuggets, useful nuggets, looking for a usable past, trying to figure out, are there any ideas in the past that would make sense today? That's why you study the history of all kinds of people. But also, when you study the history of your own community, your own denomination's history, then you're also beginning to answer questions. What does it mean to be X today? What does it mean to be a Baptist? What does it mean to be a Methodist? What does it mean to be a Catholic or a Christian? In other words, it's figuring out who you really are. We live by our stories. And so what is your story and how did it come to be, and who's telling it? What's included in the story? What are you not including? All those kinds of things. When you ask the question, why do we do something? There are really two ways of answering that question. On the one hand, you can say, why do we do this? And you really are asking a history question. How did it get started? How did it develop? What led to it being the way it is today? Janissa, you've got a last name, Stegmuller, that I don't know if it's your maiden name or married name, but you told me you live west of Waco, which means there are a lot of Germans out in that part of the state. And so did the Stegmullers come with the German immigrants in the 1850s and you've got deep roots in Texas or through your family somehow? What does that mean? And what does it mean to be a German in Texas? Because there were a lot of Union sympathizers among the Germans in Seguin and other places down there. So that the story of Germans in Texas is a story that, well, makes a lot of sense to people if they understand the last 150 years. On the other hand, when I drive to Dallas from Waco, In West Texas, there's a Czech bakery. What are Czech people doing in Texas, for heaven's sakes? All these questions, so that the developmental questions explain, how did this come to be in a historical way? The other option, though, is, why do we do this way? Do you have good reasons for still doing it that way? You know, what is it that justifies it? I spent 10 years in an international dialogue between the World Methodist Council and the Roman Catholic Church. 5 Catholics, 5 Methodists from around the world, plus 2 staff people. So there were 12 of us sitting around the table. And one year, one series, we were talking about teaching authority. And I was explaining that the Methodist equivalent to the Vatican Council is conference. We have conferences that discern the will of God and make laws for the church. And that our conferences are half clergy and half lay people. And the Catholics said, why? Well, I took it as a historical question. So I go back into John Wesley's gathering conference in 1744, all the stuff you all are going to learn over the next 2 weeks, and then explain that, you know, in the late 1800s, we began adding lay voices to conference and eventually reached this 50-50 thing. The Catholics could not care less about the history. They said, why are you doing it? Meaning, why do you continue to do it that way? Give me a justification for the continuation of this practice. Well, in the same way, when you ask that kind of why question, you really are asking about the deep logic of your way of doing church. Why do you do church in that way? What are the pros and cons? What are the advantages and disadvantages? And one of the things about going through the formation of a new Wesleyan denomination is that those kinds of why questions are at the forefront of what's going on. I'm in meetings all the time where the topic is, why should we continue doing something the United Methodist Church used to do? Or should we quit doing something the United Methodist Church used to do? Should we still have bishops? Why? Well, we're going to talk about the history of it, but when you understand the deep logic of something like episcopacy, then you can say, well, this is why we ought to belong to a church where there are bishops. Or, quite frankly, there are people arguing in the Global Methodist Church, we don't want any more bishops at all. We want a church without bishops. Okay. Let's talk about pros and cons and why we continue that way. In the split up of the United Methodist Church, some 7,600 churches have left. Only 4,600 have become Global Methodist. So you've got some independent churches that are claiming to be Methodist. Are they? Can you be Methodist and not belong to a denomination? By the end of next week, you all will be much better able to answer that question one way or the other, and talking about that. So one of the questions is, when you ask these why questions, you really are asking deep questions, both about how it developed and what's the deep logic, the way of why does this make sense, and what ways does it make sense, so that we can talk about what it means to be a Methodist today and why it's important. Now, one reason for you to really go deep into this stuff is Sharon is the only one at the table, I think, with pastoral responsibility, but maybe Everett, you get some of these questions as well. And Clinton does, obviously. So maybe the three of you, people come to you and they ask you questions when you don't have a textbook and you got to have an answer like that. My first appointment was to Prosper, Texas, back when it had 1,000 people and no grocery store. Janisa, we had to drive to McKinney to go to the grocery store. It was only 30 miles, but or not 30, but it was 10 miles. But still, that was a lot farther away from civilization than I had ever lived before. But when I was interacting with people around town, they would say, "Preacher, I got a question for you." And it could be about anything. I mean, sometimes it was the kind of thing, "Preacher, my wife and I are having troubles. What does the Bible say about divorce?" Well, you don't have the luxury of going back to your office, pulling down a textbook, and crafting a good answer. What you're doing in seminary is practicing answers that you can deliver on the spur of the moment, because you've got only one shot at giving that answer. That certainly is true in youth ministry. You get their attention on a topic that long, you better deliver. Well, there were questions. Well, my third appointment was in Commerce, Texas. And in that town, there was an African-American community, and a number of them attended Griffith Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. Okay, the CME denomination. By the time you finish this course, you will understand the CME church at least a little bit. People in my church asked, "Are these Methodists over there?" And sometimes when they would say, "Well, I go to the Methodist Church," meaning First United Methodist Church, somebody would say, "Well, there are two Methodist churches. Which one do you go to?" Sometimes well-meaning white people would say, "Why don't we just all get along? Why don't we merge the two churches together?" Once again, I slipped into my historian mode and wanted to explain to these people the history of racism in America and why there are three major Black denominations that are Methodist but have no desire at all to be united with the United Methodist Church or the Global Methodist Church. And so you get all these things going on. Understanding the story and the logic helps you figure that out. You also have to make judgments. Now, those of you who are thinking about ordination in a church, ordination leads to positions of leadership. That means you have to guide decision-making, make judgments about vision and direction. You have to sort of understand where God is leading your church and leading you, and to understand how you got to this current stage, how we all got to this current stage. Understanding that history shapes your judgment and allows you to be a better leader and to be more responsive to God's call in your life. One of the problems in studying history, and maybe none of you all have this problem, but it's something I make a judgment call about American culture in general. Americans tend to be rootless and have historical amnesia, meaning we think that 1960 was ancient history, okay? I'm 69 years old. I remember 1960. I remember the election that was held that year. When Americans forget their history, they really don't understand, how things came to be and why things are the way they are. I compared that to Europeans. I lived at Wesley's Chapel in London for a year. And as I dragged my suitcase up to the fourth floor of Wesley's house, past the bedroom in which he died, this house was built, this was its 200th anniversary. This house was 200 years old. I just realized I'm in a really old place. Well, that year, the London Times had a picture on the front page of some Irish youth spray painting on a wall, "Remember 1690." Any ideas? Why would Irish kids today spray paint "Remember 1690"? 1690 was the Battle of the Boyne, when William of Orange led an army against the Catholic Irish, beat them, and finally established the Protestant control of Ireland. And so when you've got the Orange Order in Ireland today is about Protestants who are anti-Catholic, and all of the riots and conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland go back to that conflict in the 1600s. And for them, that battle was just yesterday. On the other hand, I lived in a part of London just north of the city, and there were people in my neighborhood who had never been to Westminster to see Big Ben. My little village was Islington, and even though it was only like 8 miles to Big Ben, they were local. They went deep into history. And so when I drove to Wales one weekend, they said, "You're doing what? You're going 200 miles to Wales for just 3 days?" Shoot, I was from Kansas. You know, we would drive, my in-laws would drive 200 miles to go to dinner and then go back home the same day. So Americans are very comfortable with distance and ignorant of history, whereas the English were very comfortable with history and distance terrified them. And so figuring out the history, figuring out who you are, going against your worst instincts to sort of say, why does this matter? That's why I've written the reflection paper question the way I have. It's asking you to think about the significance of these readings. What difference does this make? What can you learn from this? How does this matter? And come at it from your own perspective. So Chris, you know, you said Antioch Church has Wesleyan roots. I've been told that. I don't know enough about it, but does this stuff matter to a non-denominational Wesleyan church? Does it matter to anybody who's active as a Christian today? I tend to think Wesley has a perspective that would be useful to a lot of Baptists and Presbyterians as well. But then that might be my bias just because that's my tradition. So that I have long been arguing to people that recovery of that the future of the Methodist movement depends on recovering its past. That in fact, we need to study what God did through the Methodist movement for its first 250 years and figure out what of that is usable. Now, friends, you can't turn the clock back. We can't make it 1750 like this. We don't want to. In 1750, there were still people enslaved. Women weren't able to be in ministry. They weren't able to vote. There was incredible poverty. I mean, there are all kinds of problems with the 1700s. And yet, my conviction is that there are aspects of what the church was doing then that are usable today, and lessons we can learn. Remember my Heiko Obermann illustration. It's like mining for diamonds. You move a ton of material for a few ounces of diamond. Well, you can read a lot of church history before you understand, before you find that nugget. But the nuggets are there. And so when you ask it from a spiritual point of view, what did God do through the early Methodists? And could God do the same thing through us? How can we account for the mistakes that were made back then? And they made them. And how can we avoid making the same mistakes in our day and time? There is a Methodist family resemblance. And so when you think about other Methodist movements or movements that came away from Methodism, or grew out of Methodism, you begin to look for some similarities. For example, we'll talk about the Pentecostal movement and the fact that the Pentecostal movement was one that grew in some places out of Methodism in the late 1800s. And so you run into some Pentecostals who understand their own history and understand that they had roots back in the Methodist movement. And so that there are some denominations, pretty small, called Pentecostal holiness denominations. There are some Black denominations that are Pentecostal that claim those kinds of roots. So you look for family similarities and you realize, oh, we're cousins. We've got some things in common. And so you look for patterns that make some sense. I'll tell you that during 9/11, I was teaching at a Methodist school in the north of England and lecturing on evangelism, and had a group of students from all over the world who had come there to take this class. And I started off my lecture with what I thought was a non-controversial sort of claim. I said, the most important of God's attributes is that God is love. Duh, I'm quoting 1 John 4. I mean, that's biblical, it's obvious. Immediately, a missionary who has been working in Uganda raises his hand in the back of the room and says, that's not right. God's most important attribute is God's sovereignty. All of a sudden, I'm looking at the Wesleyan Calvinist controversy of the 1700s playing out in front of my very eyes. That was my first indication that there were predestinarians still alive and well in the Christian world out there. And so we will talk about tulip theology as one expression of Calvinism while we're reading this. I had a next door neighbor years ago who was fully prepared to talk about which of the 5 points of Calvinism he believed in and which he didn't. In other words, here was somebody I thought was a prehistoric animal coming straight to me out of the 17th century, but living and breathing as my next door neighbor when I lived in Carrollton. So you understand your own tradition, and that allows you to adapt it appropriately, but also to understand how you relate to other traditions that are out there. I have described the Wesleyan tradition is to say that John Wesley's theological position is aptly described as the extreme center. I don't mean the center of the church. I mean the center of Christian theology, where he holds in tension some things that other people fail to connect, so that the Wesleyan tradition values highly both preaching and the sacraments. It values evangelism and social justice. It values grace and free will, justification and sanctification, church and societies. By the time you're through with this course, you will understand how Wesley held all these things together in a dynamic whole. And the purpose was to change the world so that occupying the extreme center makes us different. If Baptists are really good at evangelism, they're not so good at social justice. Catholics are really good at social justice, not so good at evangelism. And seeing how Methodism created a movement that tried to hold all these things in tension today was really, really important. It also allows you to know how we relate to other denominations. One of the things that I'm going to share my screen here and show you a drawing that I'm happy to share with you, but I'm quite frankly embarrassed because I am not artistic at all. Can you all see this? I can't see you all. Can you all, somebody say yes, you can see my screen, my chart here?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's good.
This is something I simply drew up this afternoon and took a picture of. Normally when I'm teaching, I've got a whiteboard behind me and I've already done it before class begins. Reading left to right is a sort of very, very simplified picture of Christian history. Prior to 1054, with a few exceptions, Christianity was unified around 5 patriarchs, one of whom was the Bishop of Rome. And the 4 patriarchs who were in the Greek-speaking world in 1054 decided to excommunicate the Bishop of Rome, and vice versa, over a number of issues, but one of them being the Filioque clause in the Nicene Creed, because the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, on his own authority, had added the words "and the Son" to the description of the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son. And the other 4 patriarchs said he didn't have authority to do that. It had not been done by an ecumenical council. And so the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church split off. Now, you see, when I use a chart like this, I'm already privileging the Roman Catholic Church as the main line down through the center. There are obviously other ways of doing this conceptually. What I'm trying to get across to you is, as a pastor, especially as a youth leader, figuring out some sort of visual chart like this will help Christians figure out, how do we relate to other denominations? You know, these are all Christians. Where do they come from? Why do they do things the way they do? In the western part of Europe, with loyalty to Rome, with loyalty to the Latin language, things were going well up until 1517. Now, we'll talk in a minute when I go into more detail, but you see how in 1517, Luther posted his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg Castle door. Soon after that, the Anabaptist movement began to emerge in Central Europe. The Calvinist Reformed movement began soon after that. 1559, the Church of England breaks off. Then the Puritans in the 17th century were trying to purify the Church of England. And then the Methodist movement in 1784. One of the problems with a chart like that, not only has it oversimplified everything, and the way you draw the picture makes it privileges one tradition over the other, but you have to understand that that it's a lot more complicated than it looks. But it strikes me that when you have something like that in your mind, you realize, oh, we have a lot of things in common with Roman Catholics. We have a lot of things in common with the Church of England or the Episcopalians. And to understand that flow of history and to see how they tell the story, and how they came to be who they are. Sometimes you run into some people who are part of the Church of Christ. The Church of Christ and Disciples of Christ were part of a restoration movement begun by the Campbells and others in the late 1700s and early 1800s in America. When you talk to Campbellites, they sometimes go directly from the Campbell brothers back to the New Testament, as if 1700 years of church history had never happened. And they don't really understand how their tradition was rooted in the evangelical revival, the first and second Great Awakening here in America, and the anger people had about denominations. So when my son was in sixth grade, his best friend was part of a very fundamentalist Church of Christ. We took him home to go to church on Sunday when we had a little camp out kind of thing going. And Mary Lou said, "Would you like to know the creed we believe in?" And he said, "Well, yeah." She recited the Apostles' Creed to him. First time he had ever heard it, because the Church of Christ is totally against creeds. And he said, "Well, that's nothing but the gospel." Well, duh. In other words, if you want to practice historical amnesia, that's the extreme way to do that, where you don't even know how you got to where you are. So part of I hope your goal for this course is to not only get the overall picture straight, but also have some key dates to hang it on. Somebody in the pre-session that we did before Christmas, maybe it was you, Clinton, asked me, "Am I going to give you a study sheet?" Well, yeah, I'm going to give you a study sheet for the final exam. And some of the questions will be short answer. In other words, I'll give you a date or a name or an event and say, describe the meaning and significance of this. Well, some of those will be dates. You will need to know the significance of 1784, 1939, 1968. Those are dates that you ought to be able to pull up like that for a final exam here. So that when you've been through this, you see the overall shape of the story, and it guides who you are and how you lead your organization. Now, obviously, you can't learn it all in the small amount of time we're going to be together. And so one of the problems with studying history is somebody is selecting which facts are important, which dates are important. And especially in the last 40 years, there's been a lot of criticism that too much of the history has been written by white, male, Euro-Americans, meaning people like me are teaching it, making the decisions, and we need to make a conscious effort to listen to and study the contributions of women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, people from other countries, and different ways of being Methodist. And so I will work hard at including sources from all of those places, and to get you to step out of your own background and think, oh, what would it have been like to be somebody different at that period of time than what I have been. We are a diverse church. There are lots of different ways of being Methodist, and trying to learn as many of those as possible is part of just exposing yourself to the fact there's a lot of stuff out there in addition to what I've experienced. For example, in 1968, the Methodist Church merged with the Evangelical United Brethren Church. There are not many EUB congregations in Texas. So for those of us who have lived in Texas a long time, You know, that's just not something people understand. On the other hand, if you are in Pennsylvania or Ohio, and back in the day when the name of the church was United Methodist, and you didn't have the word United there, people would get mad because that's the last vestige of their tradition that got absorbed by the larger Methodist movement. So we're going to be looking at all these different strands. The one thing I am absolutely certain of is that I'm not going to pay enough attention to every group. So if you're interested in going deeper into something, I'm happy to point you into resources about that. But figuring out what's the history of women as preachers, what's the history of women's organizations, what's the history of African American congregations. You've got to seek out those materials, and this American Methodism series has a larger printed version called the Source Book, and Ritchie, Rao, and Schmidt did a really good job of bringing together resources from a lot of people from those marginalized background. At the same time, I believe there is a common history that I think binds all of us together. And while we will pay some attention to specific groups within the whole, what I want to try to pay attention to is the common history and how everything was held together by a variety of different ways. So that what is it that all of those different Methodist groups had in common? And what does it mean to be Methodist? So that when I go into a Black Methodist church or a Hispanic Methodist church, there's something recognizable there that I want to pay attention to and to think about. I also want to call attention to some historical sins. In a sense, I'm giving you a lecture on how to do church history here. One sin is anachronism, which literally means against time. That means you tend to see something out of its place in a different time. So that if you were an activist in the civil rights movement fighting to end segregation and to see the gospel as liberating to people, all of a sudden the judgments you would bring against Francis Asbury and how he handled evangelism among slaves in Virginia, you need to think it through. What was it like for Asbury? What was it like for the slaves? What were the real choices that confronted Asbury as he was leading the Methodist movement during that period of time? So that trying to get a sense of the context and the realities that were being faced back then is important. Another sin is triumphalism. There's a 3-volume biography of Wesley by a man named Luke Tyerman, who starts off early in the first volume saying, "Is it not a truth that Methodism is the greatest fact in the history of the Church of Christ? Methodism has now existed 130 years. Is there any other system that has spread itself so widely in an equal period? We doubt it." Now, I'm a committed Methodist, but the sin of triumphalism would say, we're the only church there is, or we're the far away superior church over every other one. Well, I do think Methodism is the best way to serve Christ, but I also want to have some humility to understand we've screwed up a lot of stuff over the years. We've made a lot of mistakes. And the triumphalist attitude that says, I have nothing to learn from my other Christian brothers and sisters, that's a problem. Another historical sin, is one of self-justification, rather than being critical of your own tradition, where you try to find a way to justify everything you always do. A last one is simplicity, that somehow I don't want to get bothered with the details. Don't confuse me with the facts. I want to tell my story the way I want to tell it. When I started at Perkins, my dean was Joseph Quillian, and I'll always remember his opening speech to our entering class. He said, in Christianity, there is simplicity and then complexity, and then a simplicity on the other side of complexity. He said, as a leader in the Church of Jesus Christ, you have no right to the simplicity on this side of complexity. So it may confuse you that I'm going to be complicating your understanding of Methodism. It's complex. And yet, I hope you can sense that there's a way to get to a simplicity on the other side of complexity, so that, yeah, I understand the complexities, but here's a way to tell the story, especially those of you doing next-gen ministries. Good heavens, you know, you're not going to get a 10th grader to really understand all the different ways in which John Wesley's experience at Aldersgate Street either was or was not his conversion experience. We will go into those details, and you will understand the various perspectives on it by the time we're through. But the idea that you don't talk about it because it's complex? No. How do you talk about it in a way that nurtures the faith of Christians today and points them to the deeper realities? The other historical sin is cultural incompetence. White people often don't understand what it means to be Black, Asian, or Hispanic. Men don't understand what it means to be a woman in a male-dominated society. If we truly are going to think about the Church of Jesus Christ as being one where there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, but all are one in Christ Jesus, that means we've got to make a deliberate effort to understand people from other backgrounds and perspectives. That's part of what I love about being part of a global Methodist church, is that there are a lot of people who are different from me, but I have to sort of step out, be aware of my own limitations and biases, and learn as much as I can from other people who are going on. I want to talk a minute about Wesleyan studies as an academic discipline. My teacher, Albert Outler, talked about 3 phases of Wesley studies. Phase 1 began even before Wesley's death to about 1920. And it was a time of hero worship where, like the Tyreman quote I just gave you, everybody said Wesley is this larger-than-life figure who was great. Some of the books and things you see stem out of this period where they talk about how many miles he rode on horseback, 250,000, about preaching 40,000 sermons, lots of stories, and in fact, lots of things were attributed to him as something he said, and he never said it. But they began to draw myths about him that began to paint him as larger than life. And yet they collected a lot of things. They published a lot of books by gathering materials. It was an important phase. Phase 2 focused on Wesley as a theologian in his own right. In the same period of time, people began to read Wesley again and asking, what does this mean for being Christian in the 20th century? Then phase 3 started around 1960, where a whole group of Wesley scholars began to ask deep questions about what was it really like in the 18th century? Are some of these stories we've been telling accurate or not? A critical approach to Wesley as a historian, and understanding the different ways in which Wesley himself was hard to understand. For example, the question about his conversion, we'll see that there are differing perspectives because Wesley himself gave differing accounts of it. And so figuring out what does it really mean to talk about being converted at Aldersgate Street with his heart strangely warmed, what does that look like? There was a whole group of scholars, beginning with Albert Outler and Frank Baker, including Dick Heitzenrader and Russ Ritchie, people who were talking about that and looking at how Wesley was related to the larger church. This was the period of time of the ecumenical movement, about how Lutherans were rediscovering Luther and Calvinists were rediscovering Calvin. And so beginning around 1968, they published a new edition of Wesley's works. There are now about 30 some odd volumes of this. And some of what we want to look at are things from that published edition called the Bicentennial Edition, Bicentennial of American Methodism. And so the Wesley works, if you really want to know, have the best way of interpreting Wesley's works, Wesley's writings, you go to that edition. Albert Outler edited all of Wesley's sermons in the first 4 volumes. They've annotated every scriptural reference, every reference to some other Christian work. There are scholarly introductions written. The level of Wesley scholarship was raised to a much higher level than it ever had been before. Those volumes are still being published. I got one in the mail just last month. So that all of his letters, all of his published writings, some of his unpublished writings are in that Wesley Works edition. There was another series of books published under the imprint of Kingswood by the United Methodist Publishing House. Most of them have white covers, but these are scholarly monographs written by people on various topics related to the Wesleys. Some about the poetry of John and Charles Wesley. My book on Wesley's conception and use of scripture is in that series. Those are books that are worth paying attention to. And then there are still a number of popular books, but once you get to the popular side of things, you can find biographies of the Wesleys that simply repeat the hero worship of the 1800s rather than really asking deeply critical questions about the future. I want to ask you to think about 5 themes in the course as we're going through the next 10 days, things that you should be looking for. This will help you prepare for the final exam. One of them is the development of Methodist organization. I mean, this is a course that meets your polity requirement. We're going to talk about how Methodism was organized and the development of various features of it. So if you've ever been to an annual conference, we're going to talk about how conference first began, why, and what it was like. The second is the development of Methodist theology. Now, if you're headed toward ordination, you will take a course in Methodist doctrine. Jason Vickers is teaching, and we will not be going deeply into it, so that we're not going to be reading a number of sermons that you ought to read for that course. But how it developed over time and what led to it and how it changed as the church appropriated Wesley will be a factor. So second is the development of Methodist theology. Third, we need to pay attention to racism as a continuing factor in the life of the church. Especially in the American part of our story here, racism and slavery are the original American sin. And we've got to understand how racism and race relations fit into the Methodist movement and the ways in which it affected both the thinking and the practice of the church. Fourth is sexism as a continuing factor in the life of the church. How is it that the church has dealt with the role of women, opportunities for women? And then fifth, we'll talk about the core values of Methodism. What does it mean to be a Methodist today? Those of you who are involved in the GMC, you need to understand that part of my life is figuring out what is essential to hold on to if I'm going to be Methodist in the 21st century. And what is it that developed in the last 250 years that is baggage that's best left behind? That's a real question that I'm bringing all of my scholarly experience to bear on, because frankly, I'm sitting in meetings where we're charting the course of the Global Methodist Church. Do we need to have bishops? What kind of bishops? What's the job description? And just, I tell people, I was in a meeting with some people at a church last Sunday, and I told them the kind of bishops you've experienced for the last 50 years in your conference are not the kind we're going to have in the GMC. Well, what has been the last 50 years? And how dare I say that? But I tell them I'm going to be a bishop like Francis Asbury was, except that I will have a house, I will have a wife, and I have American Airlines. And other than that, it's going to be a very similar deal. So when we think about those themes, I want you to pay attention to the readings, the class conversation, and to be charting what are the core values of Methodism that we're looking at. Okay. My watch says it's a little after 6:20. I think it's time for us to take a 10-minute break. Come back in 10 minutes. I'm going to mute myself, and then we'll see you back here in a few minutes.
It. Ow. That hurts. Oh, great.
Yeah. This opening class session is focused on the background. We'll get into the Wesleys and the beginning of the movement tomorrow. But understanding the role of Methodism in the larger Christian tradition is crucial. And again, it's also about how we approach history in general. And one of the ways in which current scholarship focuses is to see history as an organic, complicated flow, that all these things are related to each other. So we're going to talk some tonight about politics, about religion, about wars, about economics, all kinds of things. It's also important to understand that there are all these precursors as well as markers that how we tell the story matters. One of the questions is, when did the Reformation begin? Well, I've already picked a date of 1517 because there is an event that was significant when Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the wall. But there are a whole bunch of books that talk about forerunners of the Reformation. John Wycliffe, for example, was a critic of Catholic clergy. He thought the Bible ought to be translated into the vernacular. There were lots of these people in the, well, Wycliffe was 14th century, people in the 15th century who were making the same kinds of efforts. But it really was Luther's rebellion in 1517 that sort of ignited all the kindling that had been accumulating over the centuries ahead of time. One of the questions of the Reformation is, how is it related to the rise of nation states? As the Holy Roman Empire weakened over time, different nations had different approaches to their own identity. Languages became more difficult, whereas the scholarly world used Latin. The vernaculars of German and French and Italian and Spanish and English sort of took their own courses. We hear a lot about Luther's complaints about indulgences. You also have to understand that part of that was national rivalry. He didn't want German money going down to build some church in Rome. We think about the development of the Italian Renaissance and the beauty of the artworks in the Vatican. And when you realize that the money to pay Michelangelo was coming from Germans from the sale of indulgences, all of a sudden, all this art and culture and nationality begins to get melded together and figuring out, how does this all relate to each other? I also tend to think that part of the Reformation was a breaking down of group identity and the emergence of the individual. So that Luther's problem was, how can I be saved? How can I be right with God? And the sacraments of the church weren't working for him. It didn't seem to be dealing with his crisis of salvation. Then there's also the question of, how should the Christian church relate to the nation or the government? We see that early on in the New Testament even. Christianity, how is it going to relate to the Roman Empire? Do you support the governing authorities or do you resist them? Do you pay taxes to Caesar or do you not? Well, when Constantine made Christianity acceptable and it eventually became the dominant religion in the empire, there developed a relationship between church and state that was pretty significant for the next 1,000 years. One of the things that happened during the Reformation was that different rulers took different perspectives on how they wanted to relate to the Pope, and that had something to do with whether or not they were going to support the churches separating and forming new ones. There were three main streams coming out of the Reformation in the early days. One were the Lutherans, and they had a particular doctrinal approach, but frankly, they were making fewer changes to Catholicism than the other two. The second one was the Anabaptist movement. Ana meaning again, Baptist, obviously the sacrament of baptism. These were people that when they decided that the scriptures were the only authority and they read the scriptures, they could find nothing in the New Testament except immersion of all the way under the water, and that baptism was only done, the only named people were adults. And therefore they said infant baptism is unchristian. And the Anabaptist movement became a radical Reformation that ended up fighting against Lutherans. John Calvin led a different movement that were trying to reform the church, but took a different spin on key doctrines from the Lutherans. The Lutherans had another development that's important as time went on, and that was as they gained control of different parts of Germany, they developed a kind of orthodoxy that was pretty scholastic, just like the Catholics had been during the High Middle Ages. There was a reaction against that, and a group of Lutherans became what's called pietists, meaning they focused on individual piety and certain practices. The Moravian Brethren were pietist Lutherans who developed their own kind of community and were looking for a disciplined approach to Christianity. In England, the story was different. Henry VIII was king. He had trouble having a son. But during that time, he also was a really competent theologian who wrote a paper attacking Luther, and it won him the title Defender of the Faith, which is actually a hereditary title that all the monarchs of England get to hold. There was a crisis of succession. He had a daughter, Mary, with his queen, Catherine of Aragon, but he then decided that it was Catherine's fault that he wasn't having a son. Therefore, he needed a different wife. And so he married Anne Boleyn, who also delivered a daughter, Elizabeth. And again, when he tired of Anne and there were accusations against her of infidelity, then he was able to have her condemned and beheaded. He then had married Jane Seymour and had a son, Edward VI. Meanwhile, this whole question of divorce was a theological question. It's, of course, not permitted in the Catholic Church. And his first wife, Catherine, happened to be related to the King of Spain, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor. So there were political reasons that the Pope did not want to grant him an annulment. Catherine had been married to Henry's brother, and the question all hinged on whether they had consummated the marriage or not. Henry needed a son, he thought, and therefore went ahead and separated the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, the authority of the Pope. In 1534, the English Parliament passed an Act of Supremacy that said the Pope had no authority in England. The question is, was the splitting off of the Church of England something done only for Henry's convenience, or was it also an expression of the will of the people? There was lots of dissatisfaction with Catholicism during that period of time. Monasteries had gotten to be incredibly powerful and rich in the country. And one of the things Henry did was to close monasteries and confiscate their wealth. Partly, people would give money to monasteries, and monasteries never gave anything back because they were perpetual institutions. And so Henry closed monastery after monastery. You can travel England today and see the ruins of monasteries. You might have read a poem by Wordsworth called Tintern Abbey. There's a Fountains Abbey. These were places that simply fell apart when Henry took control of them and their buildings were no longer maintained. The crucial next step was that Henry died, and the Parliament decided that the only successor was his firstborn child, Edward. So that firstborn son, so that Edward took the throne. He had been tutored by Protestants. During this time, when Henry was vacillating and separating, there were people in England who had gone to the continent to study with Lutherans and Calvinists, and they brought back Protestant ideas. The Thomas Cranmer, had been to Germany to study with Lutheran Protestants there, had married a woman secretly, came back and became Archbishop of Canterbury, and Cranmer in 1549 published an English prayer book. Once again, this was a way of moving toward Protestant Christianity, was to put things into the vernacular. Whereas Catholics were worshiping only in Latin, Cranmer and others published a prayer book in English that was the beginning of the Book of Common Prayer. Then they also published 42 articles of religion. These were statements of faith. Protestants in Europe were doing all kinds of articles, so that you find some statements of faith from Lutherans and Calvinists and others. But this was the English version, 42 articles of religion. They also published 21 sermons called homilies, so that the priests of the local churches would be able to read these out loud to their people, because the quality of preaching in England was really poor. They hadn't relied on the quality of preaching, they relied on the efficacy of Catholic sacraments. And part of the Protestant Reformation in England was to raise the quality of the preaching in every parish. Now, remember, in England at this time, there's just one church for the whole country. It is the Church of England, and when Henry took it out, everything in England changed to be Protestant at that point. And Henry had some Catholic tendencies, but gradually over time, under Cranmer's leadership as Archbishop of Canterbury, then the country became more Protestant. Unfortunately, Edward died at a young age. He was succeeded by his half-sister, Henry's firstborn child, Mary. She was called Bloody Mary. We'll talk about that a while later. But part of the reason was she decided that she had to take the church back to the Catholic faith. She was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, married to a Spaniard. She used her role as the absolute ruler of England to reinstitute Catholic faith in the country. What that meant was that there were some Protestant leaders like Cranmer who had to be punished. And back in that period of time, death by burning at the stake was a normal kind of form of execution, so that many Protestants were burned at the stake. 3 bishops were burned at the stake in Oxford. And if you go to Oxford on one of the tours, they will point out the spots in the street where the fires were built up, and Cranmer and Latimer and Ridley were all burned to death. Other Protestant leaders in England decided to go back to the continent, and there they studied under Calvinist and Lutheran teachers in those places where they could. Well, Mary did not live long either, and she was succeeded by her half-sister. Oh, Justin, you had a question.
There you go.
Well, I had a question.
Valerie.
Is the reason that burning at the stake was so common, was that because they thought if you were burned, you couldn't be raised from the dead? Or is that more of a myth?
I do not know the answer to that question. It was a painful way to die. I mean, you burned alive. They had a number of different ways of punishing people. Capital punishment was normal, but it might have to do with how painful it could be. To be drawn and quartered was the most painful way, where they put 4 horses on your 4 limbs and they literally pulled you apart. And when it was bad enough, they then cut you into 4 parts. Drawn and quartered was a literal description. The kind way to kill somebody was to behead them, so that Anne Boleyn, as a royal person, died with a sword taking off her head. So burning at the stake. I think for the Spanish Inquisition, it was understood as purification, that to be burned by fire was to be a way of purifying the person. But you're asking a good question, and I don't know. Sorry. Elizabeth I then took over for her half-sister. Elizabeth had been tutored by Protestants. And so she is called Good Queen Bess, but that's because Protestants wrote the history. Bloody Mary, what the Protestants did afterwards was to describe all the good men she killed, Cranmer, Latimer, Ridley, and they gave her the title Bloody Mary, hence the name of the drink that bars serve. But Good Queen Bess actually killed more than Mary did. She did not have strong religious convictions herself, but she believed that reaching some sort of compromise was the best way to hold the country together. She was a brilliant monarch who ruled for a long, long time, and she used religion as a way of unifying the country as much as possible. It's called the Elizabethan settlement, where she was able to steer the religious life of her country in a halfway place between the Calvinists and the Catholics, so that she believed that everybody in the country needed to pray the same way. And so they endorsed a book of common prayer. Now, we need to think back prior to freedom of religion and multiple denominations. The theory here is that everybody in England is part of the one church. It is a Christian country. Remember that bishops are lords of the realm, and bishops sit in the House of Lords. And the Act of Supremacy said that the monarch, King Henry VIII at first, and now Elizabeth, is the head of the church in England. Well, that did not sit well, that terminology. And so they changed it to the monarch being the supreme governor of the Church of England. This act of uniformity was passed in 1559, and it said that everybody in the country had to pray according to the Book of Common Prayer. They had to subscribe to the 39 articles of religion. They had gotten down from 42 to 39 articles. And they had to use the Book of Homilies that had been written by Cranmer and others. They also passed again the Act of Supremacy to say Elizabeth was queen of, was the head of the church, and the Pope had no authority over the church in England. When we say that everybody is praying the same way, the Book of Common Prayer, you may notice that people in the Anglican tradition, the Episcopal tradition, normally pray with a written book. They read their prayers. They read the liturgy. This goes back to Elizabeth's whole approach. She wanted to unify the country and to have everybody praying the same way. This was a successful method. She was popular. She stayed on the throne a long time. She never married. Hence, the state of Virginia was named for our Virgin Queen. And a lot of the power of England in naval activities, in military matters against Spain and others, she was able to establish a strong and effective international presence because she stayed clear of Rome, and the Pope excommunicated her. And so relationships, and yet there were still Catholics in England who wanted to continue worshiping that way. But to be a Catholic in England was a capital offense, and she killed people who were disobeying this act of uniformity and act of supremacy. In 1603, she died. The person next in line to the throne was another descendant of Henry VIII. James VI of Scotland was also James I now of England. And you had one monarch over both Scotland and England. Now, Scotland had been controlled by the Calvinists, so that you had Henry Knox and a lot of others, and they were giving James fits. There were no bishops in Scotland, and James came down to England and was just thrilled to have a church with bishops and one where he was the head rather than the troublesome Calvinists up in Scotland. Nevertheless, the Protestants in England saw the accession of this Scottish monarch as an opportunity. We can purify the Church of England. I think I told you that during Mary's reign, a number of Protestants left England to go to Europe. They were called exiles, and because they did it during Mary's reign, they're called the Marian exiles. They went to the continent where the Reformation was moving pretty rapidly and learned more about the authority of Scripture and the various doctrinal innovations that were going on. These Marian exiles came back when Elizabeth was queen and were unhappy with how moderate her reforms were. They wanted less of Catholic practice and more of a Calvinist extreme Protestant practice in England. And so there was a lot of thought in that period of time, the late 1500s and early 1600s, to purify the Church of England, hence the name Puritans. They got 1,000 signatures on a petition and met James on his way to London and presented him with a petition. That led to a conference at a palace called Hampton Court. Cardinal Wolsey had built Hampton Court and then been forced to give it to Henry VIII. But the Hampton Court Conference considered the millenary petition, and the only real thing that James did to respond to the petition was to authorize a new translation of the Bible. The bishops had already authorized a translation into English so that there were English versions of the Bible that were okay to use. But James authorized a group of scholars to gather at Westminster Abbey many a times to offer a new translation. So in 1611, the authorized version came, sometimes called the King James Version of the Bible, out of this whole approach. Now, there are lots of things going on on the continent during this period of time. One of them is that Calvinism after the death of Calvin was trying to cope with some basic questions about theology. And a Calvinist theologian named Jacobus Arminius began to say, as a Calvinist, that actually people had some free will restored to them by grace. That was anathema to the mainstream of the Calvinist movement. The Netherlands was a hotbed of Calvinism during this period of time. And so a group of theologians gathered at Dort, D-O-R-T, in 1619 in a synod. And the Synod of Dort decided to condemn Arminius's teachings. For them, the key watchwords were sola gratia, grace alone, and sola fide, faith alone. And anything that compromised on those two things, along with sola scriptura, but everybody believed that on the Protestant side, grace alone and faith alone, they saw Arminius as giving in too much. So the Synod of Dort came up with 5 crucial points that you had to believe if you were going to be a Christian. The acronym is TULIP. This is worth noting down and making notes. T is for total depravity. U is for unconditional election. L is for limited atonement. I is for irresistible grace. And P is for perseverance of the saints. I'll say them again. Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Now, friends, if you think that this is just archaic, doesn't matter, why do I have to sit through this professor going through this stuff from 1619? Let me tell you that while I was in Houston, I was invited to a debate with a Calvinist theologian about predestination. And these 5 points were the topic of the discussion, and there were 150 young adults gathered to listen to it. Okay? In other words, well, one of my professors said in seminary, yeah, they taught me all the heresies of the first 4 centuries, but nobody told me that they were still alive and being used today. One of the reasons you study all this stuff is these ideas haven't died out. They've not disappeared. They simply reemerge in new ways. And so for total depravity, there is for tulip theology, there is a Wesleyan antidote to each of the 5 things. If you want to make a list of the way I put it, the antidote to total depravity is simply depravity. For unconditional election, the Wesleyan answer is conditional election. For limited atonement, the Wesleyan attribute is unlimited atonement. Then for the I, it's resistible grace. And instead of perseverance of the saints, it's assurance of salvation. Well, after James I, Charles I, his son, succeeded him, and he appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. And Laud was beginning to take the church in a more Catholic direction. In other words, after the millenary petition, he and his group and the King's group were trying to make the church more and more Catholic without ever going back to the authority of the Pope. Meanwhile, the Parliament was also representative of the Calvinist side of things and wanted to limit the powers of the king. This is not a place where everybody in the country had the right to vote. Democracy was limited to landowners and the rising mercantile class who had money. And so there was a struggle for power among this rising middle class against the nobility and the monarchy. And so the question of how much power did the king have and how religion figured into that, it's complicated. Now, from an intellectual point of view, this is also the beginning of deism as an intellectual movement. If you ever read, especially those of you who are doing youth ministry, talk about moralistic deism. Deism is the idea that God does exist, that God created the universe, but like a watchmaker, he left it alone and doesn't get involved. Deism had 5 key points at this early stage: that there is a supreme deity, he ought to be worshipped, that the main point of worship is virtue, that vice and crimes people should repent of them, and that after this life there are rewards and punishments, but that God's not really involved in day-to-day life and praying doesn't really matter. This was the beginning in the 1630s during that period of time. Well, we're heading in now toward the English Civil War. And Charles I, taking the church in a more Catholic direction, having trouble with Parliament because only Parliament could raise funds and he needed more money. And so the parliamentarians began to raise their own army and fight against the king's army. And there was a series of battles going on. And finally, the Parliament side won, captured the king, and killed him. They beheaded the king, and a man named Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector. One of the things that the Parliament did during that period of time was to disestablish the church and to create freedom of religion, so that for the first time, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity were repealed, and it was possible to worship God in a variety of different denominations. They called together the Westminster Assembly to try to create one doctrine of the church that would unite all of the Protestants in England together. That assembly wrote a document called the Westminster Confession, so that among Presbyterians and the Reformed movement in America, Westminster Confession from the 1630s and 40s is the one of the touchstones of Calvinist teaching during that period of time. That was the first time that a government decided that it was going to be legal to have multiple different denominations in one political unit. Do you hear me? We in America take for granted that in a particular unit like the United States, welcome, Sakari, we're glad you're here, that within a political unit like the country of the United States or the state of Texas or Georgia or any other state, you could have multiple different expressions of Christianity, multiple different denominations. That idea was invented at the Westminster Assembly, okay? Because you had Puritans splitting into various groups. Some Puritans were Baptists who didn't practice infant baptism. Some of them were Presbyterians, a church governed by presbyters. Some of them were Congregationalists. Some of them were Church of England people who held to that old way, so that it became legal to be a member of these different churches. Now, it is still illegal to be Catholic. There is nobody who's tolerating Catholics in England from the government's point of view, but they are trying to pull it together. But the Westminster Assembly failed to unify them all. They simply split into all these different denominations. Now, on the continent, there were wars of religion that were going on, where for 30 years, different countries, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes for theological reasons, were battling against each other. And you typically had Protestants fighting Catholics, but sometimes Protestants fought Protestants for political reasons. So the 30 Years' War went on the continent and was finally settled at something called the Peace of Westphalia, Westphalia. It was reached in 1648. People were exhausted. The wars were ruining the countries, tearing up the economies of the countries. And at the Peace of Westphalia, there was a principle that was enshrined: Cuius regio eius religio. The religion of your prince is your religion. In other words, whatever the religion of the ruler was, would be the religion of the whole political unit, a duchy, a country. The whole development of nation states was just moving along here. And the idea of a nation state was being invented in the 17th century. But you've got all this stuff happening with religious overtones, and people are exhausted. And so we're just going to call it even. So in Germany, there are certain states, they called them Länder, that were ruled by a Catholic prince, and they're Catholic even to today. Other states ruled by a Protestant prince are Protestant even till today. And yet, because Germany wasn't a country, but a collection of these principalities and duchies and Länder, they had as their stronghold, as their religion, whatever the religion of the prince was. Sometimes a political unit could be a city that was granted religious freedom, but still, everybody in that in Europe, they could not imagine a political unit with multiple expressions of Christianity, and yet within Europe as a whole, you had different countries, different duchies, principalities that had different religions. Well, the same exhaustion hit England, and when Oliver Cromwell died, his son succeeded him, but people were ready. And so in 1660 came the Restoration. Charles II, the son of Charles I, came back, and at the invitation of Parliament, he had been in exile in France. He came back, and they passed the Act of Uniformity again in 1662. That meant everybody in England had to worship God according to the Book of Common Prayer. And bishops were named who were going to be friendly to this new approach. And people were exhausted from the Civil War and from other problems. They did take anybody who would not worship according to the Book of Common Prayer. They were called nonconformists. And if they were pastor of a church that got a salary, but they refused to conform, they were ejected from their living. A living is what Sharon gets for being the pastor there. There's a salary attached to that, only because it was a parish, That church was funded by the tithes of the people in that parish. That meant there was a certain salary attached to that appointment, that job as rector of that church. And so if you were not going to conform to the Book of Common Prayer, you were ejected from that living. You then became a dissenter from the Act of Uniformity. So that there were a number of Puritans and people who were on the far Protestant side that were objecting to this restoration and going back to the Elizabethan settlement. But they just decided to form their own congregations and to live outside of things. So after 1662, Catholics are illegal. You can't do that. The bulk of the country has gone back to the Church of England with the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles and the homilies. But you've now got a sizable group of people who are dissenters, who are forming their own churches. And so they were still persecuted. The man who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan, was the pastor of a Congregationalist church. And between 1662 and 1688, he was jailed for preaching. It was illegal to be a Congregationalist. And he wrote Pilgrim's Progress in jail. This was not a pretty time. Well, Charles II was moving toward being more and more high church because he had spent time in France during the Civil War. He was not happy with Parliament because they had killed his father. He had a son who became James II, and James II married a Catholic. This is bad. Then they had a child. All of a sudden, it looked like the Protestant commitment of the Church of England was going to be challenged by this crypto-Catholic James II. And so the parliamentarians staged in 1688 a glorious revolution. Parliament invited Mary, who was James's daughter, James the first daughter by his first wife, and her husband William, who was Prince of Orange, to come from the Netherlands and become king. Here is a crucial principle, friends. For the first time in England, hereditary succession of the monarch was being directed and interrupted by the Parliament. This was called the Glorious Revolution because it asserted Parliament's authority over the monarchy. So they came there, and James II fled the country and always claimed that he was going to be reinstated as the rightful king. But William and Mary became the monarchs. I've already told you about the Battle of the Boyne, where William of Orange and his army defeated the Catholic Irish. He brought stability. In 1689, Parliament passed something called the Act of Toleration. Another crucial invention here. The Act of Toleration put into the law of England the willingness to tolerate non-Church of England expressions of Protestant Christianity. England from now on was going to tolerate Protestant churches, even if they weren't the established Church of England. So that you've got the established Church of England, but people like Bunyan weren't going to be jailed for preaching if they were Congregationalists or something else. So you've got an act of toleration. It's still illegal to be Catholic. And you cannot be one of these dissenters who's outside, even if it's legal to be a dissenter. To be a dissenter means you can't be a member of parliament, you can't be a student or professor at the two universities, you can't serve in the military, but you won't be thrown in jail. And so the dissenters from 1689 on have their own way of life, their own associations. They're not part of the established church, but they're allowed to exist. Now, there are some intellectual changes that are going on during this time. The English Civil War was a very disruptive period of time. And people began to think, you know, this question of religion leads people to kill each other. And yet, we're not so sure people really know what they're talking about. The question of certainty. How do you know what is the truth? And you're so sure of it, you're willing to kill somebody over it. Well, it becomes a problem. And so there was a group of people in the Church of England called latitudinarians. Latitude is width. And the latitudinarians said, we want the church to tolerate widespread differences of emphasis and opinions. And we tend to think that the real point of religion is moral behavior. So that it's not about your Christology. It's not about debates on the nature of God. It's really about, are you living a moral life? Remember, deism said that the main way to worship was to have virtue. Well, we think the whole point of religion is to follow God's commandments. And so you have a lot of leaders in the universities and the church who are diminishing doctrinal commitments and really shifting religion into an ethical approach to things. About this time, the Royal Society was formed, and this was also the breakthrough about all kinds of scientific stuff. Isaac Newton discovered the laws of motion, discovered principles of gravity, of optics. Edmund Halley predicted the comet that carries his name. All kinds of scientific advances really took huge leaps in England after the Civil War. I think Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica was published in 1703. This was a period of great ferment, but science begins to take much more importance than religion was. During that same period of time, there were philosophies of government. John Locke wrote his 2 treatises of government. The first one was all about the Bible and what the Bible said about secular government. The second treatise on government was the inspiration for the American Constitution. But all this was happening during that period of time. Interesting enough, when William of Orange and Mary came to England, they brought with them the technology for distilling liquor, so that the Dutch had figured out how to make gin. And when William of Orange and his people came over, they brought with them gin making possibilities as well. See, I've gotten my, let me catch up here. The stream intellectually I want you to see is that the wars of religion on the continent and the English Civil War brought an intellectual crisis to people that led to deism, that led to the rise of science, that led to new understandings of freedom and government from John Locke. Interestingly enough, John Locke not only wrote the two treatises on government, he also wrote commentaries on Pauline letters and wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. So that there was a broad concern for new knowledge, and the key to new knowledge was doubt, that you could only trust your senses and trust data that could be measured. Alexander Pope was a literary figure who wrote, "Nature and nature's laws were hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." There was a kind of confidence going into the 1700s that things were going to be just great. About that time, they were applying scientific changes to agriculture. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Modern philosophy also got its start during this period of time. René Descartes was an influential philosopher in France whose whole approach was systematic doubt. You've heard his famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." In his meditations, that statement comes only when he realizes, I can't trust anything at all except that I think, and therefore I am. Deism took a strong movement upward in the 1700s, and books began to question the authority of the Bible, so that scripture was no longer the lens through which everybody viewed the world. Science was not lens now. Instead, scripture was simply one more book to be examined like every other book. And so the ground was shifting so that people who wanted to understand the world decided that a scientific viewpoint was much more important than a biblical viewpoint. When I said that they were applying science to the world around it, this was also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so that people were applying scientific learning to new ways of doing stuff that changed economics. For example, in the Middle Ages, there was a common ground for a village that everybody worked together. You've heard of the Boston Commons. Well, this common area that everybody farmed had a sense of unity for the village, that everybody got to participate in it. What began to happen in the late 1600s and escalated in the 1700s were enclosure acts. It took an act of Parliament, but more and more Parliament would pass an act allowing a political unit to enclose ground, and the owner would then own it by themselves. And that allowed for improvements to be made, and the amount of food grown in England multiplied greatly. So that enclosure was a good thing for the economy as a whole, but it displaced all kinds of people off their traditional ways of living and income. And so enclosure acts improved food production, but it also meant individual people lost their jobs. Well, that meant that people had to leave their villages and start moving toward places they could find employment. Factories were being built, coal was being mined, other mechanical changes were being made, and so that as industry began to develop, people moved from the countryside to cities wherever there was employment that could be gotten. Bridges were built over rivers, which meant that you could move goods around. Hospitals were built, and women were encouraged to go and have babies in the hospital. They were called lying-in hospitals, which lowered the infant mortality rate and the childbirth mortality rate. So that prior to this period of time, women giving birth were frequently in grave danger of dying. Now they were providing more care for them during that period of time. Along with the scientific advances, there were some medical advances. But as you can tell with these changes, people began to, individuals were often hurt, and poverty was great. And so sometimes they would result in a riot where people were protesting and reacting against the difficult conditions in which they lived. Most cities did not have a police force. Instead, the authorities called out a unit of the army, and the officer in charge of the unit would pull out a piece of paper and read the Riot Act that had been passed by Parliament and tell them, you're not allowed to do this, so disperse. And if they didn't disperse, he'd just kill them. So that it was not a time of ease. Now, I also mentioned to you that the Dutch had brought over the process of distillation for them. Well, the corn farmers were really happy about this because it provided another market for their corn. And you developed a period of time when there was what one historian called an orgy of gin drinking. So that if you were going shopping, you would go to the bakers, then the butchers, then the candlestick makers, then the hat makers, then the cloth makers. Every one of those places sold gin. So that one of the signs that was portrayed was drunk for a halfpenny, dead drunk for a penny, free straw. And one set of statistics said that more people in London died in the 1720s than were born. London grew, but that was because of immigration. And one of the contributing factors was this high level of gin drinking. Parliament in the 1720s was trying to figure out, what do we do about this? And once again, a new invention came, the sin tax. If you notice, even in America today, we put high taxes on things that are destructive of human life, like tobacco, like alcohol. This was invented by Parliament. It took them a number of tries, but they finally got to a workable tax that made drinking gin more expensive and lowered the death rate from that point of view. During this period of time, the Church of England quit having its annual convocation. The government didn't want them to meet, and because the government controlled the church, they prorogued the convocation. And so the Church of England quit developing new parishes. Think about this. People are moving to the cities, but instead of doing a church planting effort, the Church of England quit. Every inch of ground was in some parish or another, but if your parish church is 3 miles away from your new home, you're not going to go to church when you have to walk that. And so the old parish model was not functioning very well from the 1720s on. There was a response from Christian people during this period of time. Beginning in the late 1600s, a number of religious societies were formed. These were people within the church who self-organized to create a way of furthering the Christian cause, and they developed a number of different names. For example, there was the Society for the Reformation of Manners. These were people who were concerned with misbehavior, especially among the poor. The Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, SPCK. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Many of these societies were aimed at promoting holiness of heart and life. They were taking the best of the Church of England and trying to create ways in which they could urge the whole society to be a little better. Those societies had a number of different branches so that you could be a corresponding member or a regular member. You could form a society in your area that was linked to this larger national network. One of the interesting questions is that in the 1720s and 30s, a number of English people had major conversions that seemed to be unrelated to each other. A Welshman named Howell Harris had that kind of conversion. Jonathan Edwards had a conversion in America, in Boston. The Wesley brothers and George Whitefield had conversions. During that period of time, there were a lot of people seeking a more personal faith, seeking a more deeper relationship with God that was an experiential kind of relationship. Is that related to the focus of modern science on experience and empirical data? Maybe. And yet it was also related to continuing focus on the Bible and worship and all those kinds of things. I think we will quit there for tonight because my next step is to go into Epworth and the Wesley family. But that's the sort of world in which John Wesley was born, and the larger scheme of things, so that the Church of England had pockets of great strength, especially in the South, but also there was a lot of disruption in places where there was population movement that the church was not responding to very appropriately. Sakari, welcome. I told them you might have a conflict tonight, and this will be recorded, but we spent the first period of the class introducing ourselves. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, hi, I'm Sakari. I'm from Dallas, and I'm in the Contextual Witness and Innovation program.
Are you headed toward ordination?
No, my program is more vocational and focused on people who want to start nonprofits and go into business with their ministry.
What denomination are you?
I'm United Methodist. So my home church is Hamilton Park United Methodist Church in Dallas.
Okay. And so you're in Waco full time?
For the school year.
For the school year. Okay.
Yes.
So why are you taking this class?
Well, originally on my program, for contextual witness, it had Baptist identity. And since I'm not Baptist, I went on ahead and decided to switch that out with the Wesley version, or what I thought was the Wesley version of it.
And what year are you in school in Truett?
I just finished my first semester, so I'm going into my second semester this
Second
spring.
semester.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome to the class. I've got to figure out what to do with this video. I have recorded this whole class. I think I might be able to upload it to some program where you all can get to it. But I'll work on that and let you know what happens. Okay?
Thank you.
Any questions you have tonight? It's been a long time. We'll keep at it. I'll see you tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. Bye-bye.